6 hours, that's how long a car sat parked on a quiet street in Ozark, Alabama, with two teenage girls locked inside its trunk, while police officers walked past it, ran the plates, and waited on a tow truck. 6 hours before a single person thought to look for a trunk release lever. And it would take 24 more years, through 6 versions of a false confession, 3 innocent men cleared by their own blood, and 1 DNA sample that sat waiting in a state lab with nowhere left to go, before anyone learned the name of the man responsible. He was a preacher, a husband, a father of 2, and for 2 decades he lived less than a mile from the exact spot where he left them. Before we get into this one, if this is your first time here, this channel is built around cases just like it. Real investigations that sat cold for years, sometimes decades, before science or a single overlooked detail cracked them open. Hit subscribe so the next one lands in your feed. And down in the comments, tell me which state you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this one travels. JB Beasley and Tracie Hawlett grew up 10 minutes apart in Dothan, Alabama, and by high school the two of them were inseparable. Both girls attended Northview High School. JB was the lively of the pair, energetic, always moving, the kind of girl who made a room feel busier just by walking into it. Tracie was quieter, steadier. Her biological father had been a police officer named Robert Hawlett, and he had drowned in Lake Eufaula when Tracie was still a small child. Her mother, Carol, later remarried a man named Michael. Everyone called him Mike, and Mike raised Tracie from that point on as his own daughter, without hesitation and without exception. JB's mother, Cheryl, would later describe her daughter simply as a gift. On the night of July the 31st, 1999, the two girls set out to celebrate something happy. It was JB's 17th birthday, and there was a party waiting for them in a town not far from home. They never made it. Somewhere on the drive, the girls got turned around. Instead of arriving at the party, they ended up more than 20 miles off course, in a town called Ozark that neither of them knew well. A little before 11:30 that night, they pulled into a Chevron station called the Big Little Store on East Broad Street, which had already closed for the evening. A woman named Marilyn Merritt happened to be there with her daughter, and the girls asked her for directions back toward the highway. Merritt would later tell investigators there was nothing alarming about either girl, just 2 polite, well-dressed teenagers, a little embarrassed about running late. Tracie used the payphone outside to call her mother. Carol picked up and her daughter sounded exactly like herself. No panic, no hesitation in her voice. They had directions now, Tracie told her. They were on their way home. Mother and daughter said the words they always said to each other before hanging up, and Carol went to bed expecting to see her daughter walk through the door within the hour. Out in the parking lot, Marilyn Merritt watched the girl's black Mazda pull out and turn toward the highway, following her directions exactly. It was the last time anyone but their killer would ever see either girl alive. By 8 the next morning, both families had already called the police. Neither girl had come home. Around that same hour, an Ozark patrol officer spotted JB's black Mazda sitting on Herring Avenue, less than a mile from the payphone Tracie had used the night before. The scene told a strange, almost contradictory story. The car hadn't been in a wreck, both doors were unlocked, a window sat cracked open. JB's driver's license was resting in plain view on the dashboard, and both girls' wallets, purses, and cash were still exactly where they'd left them. Nothing had been taken. But the outside of the car was streaked with mud. The gas tank was nearly empty despite being filled the day before, and dry sand had somehow made its way into the front seat, as though the car, or the people inside it, had spent time somewhere very different from this quiet, paved street. An investigator from the Dothan Police Department was sent out to oversee the tow. He walked the length of the vehicle, looked through every window, and settled in to wait for the truck to arrive. Nobody thought to try the trunk. It sat there, in plain sight of multiple officers, for close to 6 hours. It wasn't until nearly 2 o'clock that afternoon that the investigator finally noticed an interior trunk release lever and pulled it. Inside were JB Beasley and Tracie Hawlett, each killed by a single gunshot wound from a 9mm handgun. One shell casing rested on Tracie's leg, the only one investigators would ever recover. Based on how the bodies were positioned, it appeared Tracie had been placed into the trunk first, with JB on top of her. Both girls were still fully clothed. Tracie had a fresh scratch on her arm and briar thorns caught in the fabric of her pants. The sneakers she had bought just days before were caked in mud. Nothing about Herring Avenue, dry, paved, unremarkable, matched what their bodies seemed to be telling investigators about where the last hour of their lives had actually taken place. Robbery made no sense as a motive, and for weeks that left detectives with a crime scene and no story to explain it. Then, roughly 2 months later, the state forensic lab delivered a result that reframed the entire case. Biological evidence, semen, had been recovered from JB's clothing, along with an unidentified palm print lifted from the underside of the trunk lid. The district attorney at the time confirmed publicly that JB had been sexually assaulted. Whoever left that sample was, in all likelihood, the person who had killed both girls. It should have been the piece of evidence that closed the case within weeks. Investigators ran it against Alabama's own criminal database. Nothing came back. They ran it against CODIS, the FBI's National DNA Index. Still nothing. The man who left that sample had never been arrested, never convicted, never given any law enforcement agency in the country a reason to have his DNA on file anywhere. The evidence itself was flawless. It also pointed at exactly no one anyone could find. The murders reshaped both towns almost overnight. A reward fund grew with local and state contributions. Investigators carried out hundreds of interviews and ran DNA comparisons against dozens of potential suspects. Not one of them matched. About a month after the girls were found, a man named Johnny Barentine walked into the Ozark Police Department claiming he had information about what happened. Over 4 hours of questioning, his story shifted again and again, at first placing himself nearby as a witness, and eventually claiming he had watched a stranger get into the girls' car and lead them out to Herring Avenue himself. He was arrested, and for a brief moment, both towns believed the case was finally closed. It wasn't. Not one version of Barentine's story ever accounted for the sexual assault, the single most important piece of physical evidence investigators had. When DNA testing excluded both Barentine and the man he'd accused, the confession fell apart completely. Brought before a grand jury, Barentine eventually admitted he had invented the entire account chasing reward money. The grand jury declined to indict him, and investigators were left having spent months chasing something that had never happened. Other leads collapsed almost as quickly. A man who left town abruptly right after the murders was tracked down out of state and cleared by his own DNA. A drifter passing through from Mississippi was located and cleared the same way. Store security footage had also captured a blurry image of a white pickup truck sitting at the gas pumps around the same time Trusser was on the payphone. No gas was ever purchased from that pump. Even after investigators released the footage publicly, no one ever came forward to identify the truck or the person driving it. None of it brought Carol Roberts or Sherrod Buggan any closer to an answer. It just meant living, year after year, without one. The case aired on national television more than once over the following years. Tips poured in from across the country. None of them held up. The original detectives eventually retired, and new investigators inherited a file that hadn't moved in a very long time. Every so often, someone would run the DNA sample against an expanding national database, and every single time the answer came back the same: no match. The problem was never the science. The sample sitting in that evidence room was every bit as complete and usable as the day it was collected. The problem was that a national DNA database can only return a name if that person's DNA is already inside it, and the man who left that sample had simply never given anyone a reason to put him there. He could have been standing in line at a gas station in Dothan, and every database in the country would have looked straight through him. If you've made it this far, comment, "I'm still here." Let's know who is truly following this shocking story. Before we get to how this finally broke, do me a favor, tap that like button. It genuinely helps a smaller channel like Cold Case USA get these stories in front of more people, and this one is about to take a turn most true crime cases never get. In April of 2018, investigators in California announced the arrest of a former police officer named Joseph James Durangella, identifying him as the man behind a long string of murders and assaults committed decades earlier, a case that had come to be known publicly as the Golden State Killer. Durangella had no criminal record and no DNA sitting in any government database. What finally found him was a technique no law enforcement agency in the country had ever used before that point: uploading crime scene DNA to a public genealogy website, the kind ordinary people use to research their own family history. The search didn't return Durangella's name directly. It returned distant relatives instead, people who shared small fragments of his DNA without having any idea why it mattered. From there, investigators built family trees outward, generation by generation, branch by branch, until exactly one name fit every single one of them. Ozark Police Chief Mullers Walker was watching all of this unfold from Alabama. In August of that same year, he sent the untouched 1999 crime scene DNA sample to Parabon Nanolabs, the private genetic genealogy firm that had helped build the case against Durangella, and asked them to try the exact same approach with his own department's case. Parabon's analysts built out family trees from partial genetic matches until the list narrowed down to a small handful of Alabama families. When Chief Walker reviewed the results himself, one particular name stopped him cold, not because it appeared anywhere in 20 years of case files, tips, or interviews, but because he recognized it personally from a lifetime spent living in the same small community. The man on that list was 45 years old, a long-haul truck driver who had spent decades on routes running out of the region, an ordained minister with no criminal record at all, married for years, with 2 children of his own. He lived less than a mile from Herring Avenue. His name was Coley McCrunner. Walker brought McCrunner in, but not as a suspect, at least, not in the way McCrunner was told. He was framed as a community member who might be able to help narrow down a list of possibilities. McCrunner agreed without much resistance to give a DNA sample. His wife, Janet, encouraged him to cooperate. By every account, nothing in their life together up to that point had ever given her a single reason to hesitate. The lab result left no room for ambiguity. The DNA taken from Coley McCrunner's cheek matched the sample recovered from J.B. Busler's clothing in 1999, exactly. On March 16, 2019, McCrunner was arrested and charged with multiple counts of capital murder and 1 count of rape. He denied knowing either girl. He denied ever being near the scene. He denied any involvement whatsoever. The reaction across both towns wasn't quite relief. It was closer to disbelief. This was a husband, a father, a preacher people had greeted after church, passed on the road, made small talk with at gas stations for 20 years, a man who had spent 2 decades living inside the same small radius as the families of the girls he was now accused of killing, without a single person ever looking at him twice. The pandemic delayed the case for years afterward. It wasn't until April of 2023, nearly 24 years after the murders themselves, that Coley McCrunner finally stood trial in Dale County, before Judge William Fulmer. McCrunner chose to testify in his own defense, a decision that opened him up to direct cross-examination with nowhere left to hide. And the story he told the jury bore almost no resemblance to the flat denial he had given investigators back in 2019. This time, he claimed he had met JB at a shopping mall months before the murders, that she had introduced herself using a different name, and that the 2 of them had exchanged phone numbers. He testified that his own truck had broken down that same night at the very gas station where the girls happened to stop, that he recognized her, and that the 2 of them had consensual sex inside his truck cab before the girls drove him home and went on their way. Prosecutors had nothing to support any part of that story. No phone records, no witnesses. Nothing placing the 2 of them in contact before that night. Marilyn Merritt's account of 2 anxious, polite girls asking a stranger for directions didn't line up with a planned meeting, and neither did Tracy's phone call home to her mother. Alabama's Attorney General walked McCraney through his own version of events during cross-examination, pressing him on just how much he claimed had happened in well under an hour. Then came Jeanette McCraney, compelled by the court to testify against her own husband. She told the jury that on the night of July 31, 1999, McCraney had left their home around 1:45 and hadn't returned until roughly 1 in the morning, explaining, at the time, that his car had broken down at a gas station. The same gas station where 2 teenage girls had just asked a stranger for directions home. On April 26, 2023, the jury convicted Coley McCraney on every count. The following day, jurors declined to recommend the death penalty, and McCraney was sentenced instead to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Carol Roberts sat completely still when the verdict was read aloud. Cheryl Burgoon broke down in tears. Mike Roberts, who had raised Tracy from early childhood, who had shown up to every hearing and every dead-end update for 24 straight years, was sitting in the front row to hear the word guilty spoken out loud. Less than a year later, in January of 2024, Mike Roberts passed away at the age of 74. He had held on just long enough to see it through to the end. From prison, Coley McCraney has continued in interviews to maintain his innocence, insisting he is not the man responsible for what happened to JB and Tracy. The DNA, the very same sample that sat waiting inside a state lab for 2 full decades, unmatched and seemingly unmatchable, until a search method finally existed that could find him, says otherwise. 24 years, 1 DNA sample that was flawless from the very first day, sitting inside a database that simply had no way of seeing the man it belonged to, until the technology itself finally caught up to the evidence. That's the case. If it stuck with you the way it stuck with me, let me know in the comments what part of this one got to you the most. Last thing before you go, like this video if you want to see more cold cases broken down like this, drop a comment with your theory or reaction, and subscribe with the bell on so you catch the next one the moment it drops. Thanks for watching Cold Case USA. I'll see you in the next one.